This is SSN
Story Studio Network.
Welcome to the Fatigue Fixer podcast. Have you ever wondered why you and most of the women you know seem tired so much of the time? Well, this is the podcast where we explore why. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Vedboncoeur. I'm a naturopathic doctor, hockey and baseball mom, bookworm, and nerd at heart who's fascinated by the state of modern women's health and well-being. I've had the privilege of treating thousands of women in my practice over the past 14 years, and hearing your stories has taught me an important lesson. Women are incredibly strong, resilient, and self-aware. And yet, too many of us are struggling to show up fully in our lives because we're tired and unwell. I want you to have the energy you need to share your unique gifts with the world because we are in desperate need of more female leadership. So join me for conversations that will help you feel less alone, more informed about all the things that might be draining your energy, and inspired to fix your fatigue and wake up every morning feeling rested and excited for the day ahead. I can't wait to share today's episode with you. So let's get into it. Have you ever walked into a room and completely forgotten why you're there? Or struggled to find the right word in the middle of a conversation? Maybe you've missed an appointment you swear you wrote down, or put something in the wrong place, like your phone in the fridge. If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. 2/3 of women experience memory and cognitive changes during the menopause transition. And for many, fatigue plays a big role. That's because the same hormonal shifts that cause brain fog also disrupt sleep, increase stress, and change how your brain produces energy, leaving you feeling mentally and physically drained. It's not all bad news, though. These changes are temporary and rarely a sign of early Alzheimer's, even if you have a family history. Your brain is remodeling, not failing you, and with the right support, you can regain your memory, clarity, and energy. This is the one where menopause messes with your memory. And my guest today is Dr. Daiana Castleman, a naturopathic doctor and menopause certified practitioner whose passion for menopause care was ignited by witnessing her mother and aunt navigate their own transitions. Their experiences became the driving force behind her commitment to improving care for women at this life stage. Dr. Castleman's goal is to empower women with evidence-based knowledge so they can thrive for as long as possible in the best health possible. In addition to her naturopathic medicine degree, she obtained her Menopause Society Certified Practitioner designation from the Menopause Society in 2022, ensuring she provides holistic, comprehensive care that doesn't overlook any aspect of a woman's well-being. She's pioneering a new movement, one where women aren't bound by the health outcomes of their mothers or grandmothers, but instead take proactive steps towards better health and longevity. Today, we'll dive into what's happening in your brain, why these changes occur, and what you can do to support your memory and energy during perimenopause and beyond. Daiana, welcome to the Fatigue Fixer.
Thanks, Sarah, for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. I'd love to start with just you sharing a bit more about what you witnessed with your mom and your aunt when they went through their menopause, and what did you see happening that you wish had been different?
Great question. So specifically with my mom, I was more surprised by the lack of conversations that we're having with her healthcare provider, which is not uncommon for many people, and nothing to do with, her doctor not being a good doctor. I just want to highlight that. But again, it comes back down to our training, right, in this area. And I know you've probably spoken about this many times on your podcast before. And I just want to say it's not just medical doctors, it's us as naturopaths too. I definitely didn't feel well equipped to support this population of women until I did my additional training in this area. And so, when I think about my mom and not just the symptoms that she was going through, but looking at her health, of course, 20, 30, 40 years from now, and I want her to be in the best health possible. possible, I really started to dive into that research and look at, okay, well, what conversations can we be having to help her feel empowered? And obviously I want her to be around as long as possible in the best quality of life. And, really it just started from there, and we started discussing, having conversations. And I was really just trying to help her advocate in her appointments, right? To say like, maybe bring this, like talk about this. Here's, something you can share with your doctor. And she found that really, really valuable. And that honestly, ever since then, it really changed my practice, and I haven't looked back.
I love that. I think the conversation is changing, but I think there's still this perception that menopause or perimenopause is really things like hot flashes and night sweats. Like those are the things that we know. If that's happening at a certain age, most women understand that that's likely due to menopause and perimenopause. But I think a lot of women don't fully appreciate or understand how so many of the symptoms, especially in those early perimenopause years, so many of those symptoms are brain symptoms, right? The mood changes, the memory that we're going to focus on.
The sleep even
the
too,
sleep.
Right? Yeah.
Oh, don't talk to me about the sleep. There was snow removal happening outside my window at 2 a.m. last night, which woke me up. And then I had shitty sleep after. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. One of the things that I really like or want us to talk about today is this idea that our brain is remodeling or renovating itself through the perimenopause transition. And that's kind of wording that I've heard through Lisa Mosconi, who's doing really incredible work. And we know that about most women experience some changes in their memory and their cognition and feel a lot more forgetful. So what's happening in the brain specifically in perimenopause, and how is that affecting things like our memory and brain fog?
You brought up Dr. Lisa Mosconi, Sarah, and she's a wonderful researcher. And she recently published a study in 2024, so last year, her and her team. And this definitely is starting to open up that conversation, right? Because we know that women's health has been so under-researched for so long. This study was really fascinating. So they imaged 18 brains of premenopausal, 18 perimenopausal, 18 postmenopausal women aged 40 to 65. And basically what they were looking at is recording the density of the estrogen receptors in various brain regions that are known to be regulated by estrogen. And so the postmenopausal brains actually looked overall brighter on the scans. It was indicating that actually the women's brains had significantly more estrogen receptors than the premenopausal brain, which is very fascinating. And so they were interpreting this, like one of the theories behind this is that it's this compensatory response to the waning levels of estrogen levels. And so as estrogen levels drop during that menopause transition into postmenopause, the cells essentially are expressing additional receptors to sop up all that estrogen as much as possible. And so what's exciting to see is where future research is going to go is whether those estrogen receptor density changes with estrogen therapy, right? So that's what we're going to, the next phase of research is going to be looking into, which is really exciting. And to see if that leads to fewer symptoms, and then you could have better performance on cognitive tests potentially. So we don't have that research yet, but I thought that estrogen receptor density happening at the level of the brain, that's really fascinating, right? And we're starting to now see more of that research. And again, we need more funding for these studies to happen.
Yeah. So I think the take-home message that I want anyone listening is to understand how important estrogen is for your brain. Estrogen is doing a whole bunch of stuff in your brain. And I think what that study kind of confirms is that when estrogen levels drop, which is what happens in perimenopause and menopause, the brain is literally probably doing everything it can to try to soak up and get some of that estrogen. Because we know, and the other thing I've seen that Lisa Mosconi does that's really cool is she'll show a brain scan of brain energy utilization in premenopause, and you'll see these brains that are fully lit up. And then she'll show you a scan of a woman post-menopause, and the brain scan is not as lit up. And a lot of that is that estrogen really impacts how our brain produces and uses energy. And two of the areas that we know are really affected. So one is the hippocampus, and that's the part that affects our memory. So that's one of the reasons we see these memory changes. But the other area is the prefrontal cortex, right? And that has to do with executive functioning. I was also thinking in the shower this morning how it also has to do with impulse control. And I was thinking about how so many women are also kind of like enraged and have like they have a harder time keeping things in. And I'm like, I wonder if this is part of it, that our ability to control some of those impulses has gone down. So estrogen is so important for those different parts of the brain. And I think what we see when women are going through menopause is kind of like a double whammy, because they're getting older, which we know is a risk factor for memory changes. And they're going through a big kind of change hormonally, especially with their hormone levels and estrogen dropping. So when those two things are happening at the same time, it can really affect a woman's memory, which can feel quite like scary and destabilizing. Can we talk a bit about brain fog? So I think a lot of women also report brain fog. What is brain fog, and what are some of the things that might cause that?
For sure. So I think you mentioned this at the beginning, about 40 to 60% of midlife women are going to report cognitive symptoms. So I just want to highlight this is very common. So things like forgetfulness, how it shows up in a lot of my patients will be difficulty remembering words. Like maybe they've, worked with a coworker for X number of years and they like literally cannot say cannot remember their name. And then the other big one is the inability to focus and concentrate. That's a big one that I see for sure. And that of course can impact work and other areas of life as well. I always come back to, so again, estrogen, of course, is extremely important, but I also want to highlight that menopause is not a brain disorder. I think language is really important when we're talking about specific areas, especially of women's health, because I've seen that quoted sometimes on social media as if, menopause is a brain disorder and therefore we need estrogen as that treatment. I don't like that language at all. I think it's actually very disempowering to think of it as a disorder that we now, again, need to do something about. And we could talk about the hormone therapy research as well. I'm happy to dive into that. But yeah, symptom-wise, that's definitely how it presents for a lot of my patients. One thing I always look at, especially in that menopause transition, is that there also can be many other things that can be impacting brain fog. So one thing I always look for, especially if someone is menstruating, asking about their menstrual cycle. Has it gone heavier? It could be coming much more often, much closer together. And so iron deficiency can definitely cause that like brain sluggishness and they don't feel as sharp. So I know you talk a lot about iron, Sarah. I know you're super passionate about it as well, but it really is something I find is not taken as seriously. So, we need to look at the other aspects that are being impacted as well. And that also comes with those symptoms, other symptoms of the menopause transition, and sleep disturbances is also a really big one. We do also know that sleep apnea, for example, obstructive sleep apnea is also something that increases around this time. And we typically think of like the traditional symptoms of like loud snoring, gasping for air. But in women, it can actually show up very differently. It can show up as like a morning headache, non-restorative sleep, depression, mood changes, and that impaired memory. And so that's something I'm always going to want to screen for as well, because I've definitely had patients who've gone through a sleep study, they treated the sleep apnea and their brain function got significantly better, right? So this is what our work is as clinicians as well, is to see, okay, are there any other causes that could be a factor here? And the other one I want to mention here with brain fog as well, midlife definitely presents a time where we do fall in sort of this sandwich generation, right? Where we are maybe caring for aging family members. We have children that are still dependent on us. There is a lot of, I truly think much more of those things going on. So full-time work, parenting, caregiving. And I do think that stress can be playing a big role here in that resiliency aspect. The thing that I commonly see and what I talk to my patients about is they will say, I have the same tasks or same things going on in my life, but I feel less resilient to be able to tackle those things. And again, it can be that multifactorial contribution to that brain fog at this time.
Yeah, I think that's so important because there is such a big conversation happening online finally, which I'm all for.
Yeah.
But the other thing I see, and I don't know if you see this as well, is now we're just blaming everything.
I was just going to say that, correct?
Everything that anyone has in their 40s is now perimenopause.
Yeah.
And I think what you said, and I think the work that we do, part of why it's so important and part of why I think patients like to work with us is we're looking at the big picture. And you brought up some really important points that some of it is 100% hormonal.
Yep.
And a lot of it is probably also other things. And you brought up some really important ones, the sleep apnea, the iron deficiency.
Yeah.
We also know that anything that affects your heart health or your metabolic health impacts your brain. And we know that perimenopause is a time where we'll often start to see some of those early signs. Cholesterol starts creeping up, blood pressure, blood sugar start creeping up. So it's really important that we also look at what's happening kind of metabolically. So some of the things that we know kind of increase our risk of certainly things like dementia and Alzheimer's are going to be depression, cardiovascular disease, diabetes.
Yes.
There is this idea of Alzheimer's being a diabetes of the brain or type 3 diabetes, because we know that even people who have normal blood sugar, so even if you're not diabetic, if your blood sugar, the higher your blood sugar is, even within that normal range, that can increase your risk of dementia. So I think it's really important that, especially right now, sometimes in our medical system, we're brushing off small changes because they maybe don't meet the official criteria for, maybe your cholesterol isn't so high, you need a medication. Maybe your blood pressure isn't so high, you need a medication. But those things are increasing your risk. They're not just impacting how you feel right now, but they are impacting your risk of what your brain health is going to look like down the road.
And this is where knowing your numbers is so important.
Yes. I'm literally doing a workshop called Know Your Numbers. That's so funny.
But that's exactly
that was unplanned.
That is education, I think, is a huge, huge component of this. And you really nailed it there. I think it's that point of why do we wait for it to get bad enough to then do something about it, right? And knowing your numbers is probably the most empowering place that you can be, knowing what your LDL cholesterol should be, your HbA1c, all those pieces. When you actually look at the dementia research and on prevention, up to 50% of it is modifiable. That's huge. That's really, really big. And there's basically the 14 modifiable risk factors that have been listed. And you mentioned a lot of those and some other pieces, like stopping smoking and, limiting alcohol and all of physical activity, right? All of those pieces also play a big role. But whenever I say that to my patients, it's often shocking to them. They're like, wow, I didn't know so much of it was modifiable, because we have to think, okay, it affects more women than men. And then we feel that, okay, well, there's not much I can do about it, but actually there's so much we can do. And it starts now. It starts now to impact your health, again, 20, 30, 40 years from now.
Yeah. I think another really important thing I learned from Lisa Mosconi is that even though Alzheimer's shows up in old age, it starts in midlife.
100%.
The things that you do in your late 30s, 40s, and 50s are going to determine what your life looks like in your 70s and 80s. I also think, especially with things with Alzheimer's, we have this false sense that they're mostly genetically driven.
Correct.
And that can go both ways. It can go in the sense that if you have a family history, you kind of feel like, well, I'm going to have it because it's in my genetics. Or if you don't have it, maybe you underestimate your risk. And what you said is so important. Up to 50% are modifiable, meaning they're based on things that you can control. Exactly. And I want to get into more of those. But what are some of maybe the other knowledge gaps? Are there things that you're educating your patients on kind of on a regular basis that women aren't what are some of those aha moments that you're maybe teaching them and they're like, I had no idea? Are there any others that you can think of?
Yeah, actually one that comes to mind is the ApoE gene. So
I was going to ask about that. So perfect.
Yeah. I get asked a lot about that, and I think it's great to have a conversation around it. So for those of listeners who don't know, ApoE stands for apolipoprotein E. And basically in the brain, it's responsible for transporting cholesterol and other lipids to and from neurons. around. So I kind of think of it as this like car moving cholesterol around in the brain. And there's different variants of it. There's E2, E3, and E4. And oftentimes people have heard of the E4 being the variant that, can really increase risk for Alzheimer's disease. Just quickly, ApoE2 is typically seen to be protective for Alzheimer's and dementia. It's not very common. Only about 8% of people in the world have it. ApoE3 is the most prevalent one. It has slightly higher risk than ApoE2, but less than ApoE4, and it's about 77% of the population. And then ApoE4, this is the one that confers the highest risk. Now, it will matter if you have 1 copy or 2 copies. So, for example, if you have 1 copy, you're about 3 times more likely to get Alzheimer's. And then if you have 2 copies, risk increases actually to about 12 times. So it's quite a significant increased risk if you have 2 copies. Now, what I want to remind listeners is that not everyone with this variant will develop Alzheimer's disease, right? It's one factor, but sometimes people want to know, especially if they have a family history, because, knowing that status can give them more information about their risk, and maybe they would take, their health more so, more seriously, so to speak. Now, the conversation I have in my practice is I often get asked, should I get this tested? Should I run this? It's really a personalized decision. The biggest question I'm going to ask my patients is it going to empower you to know that information, or is it going to give you anxiety, right? Mm-hmm. Because some people, it really will empower them to take their lifestyle and health habits really seriously, but others, they're going to be constantly thinking about it, constantly thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to get it, so then it wouldn't be an empowering place. So I don't think it's mandatory to get this test done. Again, it's very individualized, but it's something you can consider if you think that it would, give you that information that could be a really good part of your treatment plan and decision-making process.
The one thing I would add to that, and I totally agree, is the importance of genetic counseling. And part of the problem now is anyone can order genetic testing off the internet with no counseling, no real interpretation. And again, we tend to be very fatalistic about genetics, that we assume that if we have something, it is going to guarantee that we have this disease. And there are very few genes that are that deterministic. So
it's true.
To really be thoughtful about how you're going to metabolize that information and what you're going to do with it. So let's chat about testing. We've talked about getting your iron levels checked, blood sugar, cholesterol. I would add thyroid in there because we know that can have a huge impact on brain and cognitive function. But the other one I want to add, because this is something I've learned just from people in my life who've experienced hearing loss. Hearing loss is a massive risk factor for dementia.
It is. It's one of the 14 modifiable.
There you go. And I can tell you, I'm very health conscious. I have never had my hearing checked. So I am adding that to my list. And I had to look this up, and I'm going to start talking more about this. But these are the Ontario guidelines. If you're under 50 and you have no signs of hearing loss, you should get your hearing checked every 3 years. If you're between 50 and 65, every 2 years. And even if you don't think that you have hearing loss, apparently 1/4 of people who don't think they have hearing loss actually do. And then if you're over 65, you should go annually, because at that age, we see more than 30% of people. So again, a lot of these things are modifiable. They're things that we have agency and control over. But I just want to talk about that hearing one, because I feel like we don't talk about hearing enough.
Yeah. And when I think about the hearing, I think about social connection, right? So I think people who are, they could be embarrassed, they can't maybe hold conversations as well. And we know that social connection is again, one of those modifiable risk factors, but it's a huge component of this. And we talk about it a lot, but that's maybe where I think it could be playing a big role. One of the ways, right, is that they're going to remove themselves from society. Now they're going to be isolating themselves, and then that's going to really contribute to increased risk. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad you brought that up because, again, you can contact your family doctor, for example, and set aside an appointment just separately for this specific reason, right? And that would be something to just let your doctor know about and say, hey, I'd really like to discuss my risk factors, for cognitive decline. And I'd love to book a hearing test, like having those conversations are incredibly important.
Yeah. And like you said, just being proactive, which I think is great. Let's talk about social connection, because that was one of the things I want to touch on. And I think, again, people underestimate how important our relationships and social connection is. And I think a lot of times we think about like elderly people who live alone, and that is terrible. But when I also think about the average woman that I know in her 40s and early 50s going through perimenopause, she's busy. She's busy with work and her kids in sports and trying to do her own activities. Like, I feel like friends are the things that we always put at the bottom of the list. It's like a nice thing if we have a little bit of time. And I think we need to completely think about that differently. Our friends are one of our top like allies in our health, and we need to prioritize that more.
And to add to that, Sarah, I completely agree. It's like the quality of your friendships as well, right? I think that's maybe even sometimes harder, to find within our social circle. I know myself, I've gone through that experience. It's not only difficult to keep those relationships, but then have those really good quality relationships that you can, just not only feel like yourself, but have authenticity and be able to talk about these kinds of conversations, right? And if you do have those, if you're listening, hold on to those friendships. They're extremely important. But yeah, I would say, even when you look at a lot of the research, I think there isn't one guideline that doesn't, have it on there. It's that important to maintain a sense of community and purpose. Yeah,
absolutely. Can we circle back to around hormones and specifically women who have hysterectomies or who may go into a surgical menopause? So surgical menopause is when you have your ovaries removed and literally overnight you're officially in menopause because it's a very dramatic drop. Some of the stats I found were that if you went into surgical menopause under the age of 46, that could increase your risk of dementia by 70%. What do women need to know about? And I want to be clear, this is not to discourage hysterectomy. Some women need and benefit from hysterectomy. But I think this is something that I haven't, when women have asked me pros and cons, I haven't included this, and I'm going to include it now. And I think this is not part of the conversation when women are thinking about hysterectomy. So what do women need to know and think about if they're contemplating or if they've had a hysterectomy, specifically around impacts on memory and cognitive risk?
Great question. I think the counseling around this, what I've seen from a medical perspective, has definitely gotten better. So if women are going through the process of, having their not only uterus removed, but ovaries as well, then they're being counseled on what that looks like after, again, maybe depending on the type of cancer they've had, they may or may not be good cancer for hormone therapy, but of course that's an individualized conversation. You are correct about that stat, and it is really scary to think about that. I think the most challenging cases I've had personally in practice are those patients who maybe had surgical menopause, were never counseled, and now they're 70.
Yeah.
It's a hard place. I don't have a good answer for that, right? Because we know that initiating hormone therapy maybe a little bit too later on is also not an advantage. Those are really difficult, sometimes conversations to have. But you are correct that menopause hormone therapy is currently recommended for maintaining brain health in women who do undergo bilateral ovary removal, like before the typical age of menopause. So that is a standard. But menopause hormone therapy is not recommended to prevent or treat cognitive decline or dementia for anyone going through the natural menopause transition, right? So if you have your last menstrual period between the ages of 45 to 55, that we're not using hormone therapy and preventing cognitive decline at that stage because we don't have the evidence. So the biggest reason here is we're losing estrogen a lot sooner, right? A lot sooner than we would like it to. It's very protective for our brains, and that's where the risk really comes into play.
Okay, can we talk more about that? Because I think, again, when you open up Instagram, it sounds like estrogen is going to fix every problem you've ever had in your whole life. And I think there are people who are maybe more generously interpreting the research, maybe is a nice way to put it. And certainly giving the impression that there is evidence right now for giving estrogen for brain health and for memory. So I just want you to restate that. Currently, based on the different Menopause Society guidelines, it is not recommended to start menopause hormone therapy in order to treat or prevent.
Yeah, exactly.
Like dementia.
Cognitive decline. Yeah. Right now, I think what's really important to note is that there hasn't been one clinical trial done for menopause hormone therapy and dementia prevention among women in perimenopause. Not one, right? So I think that's just really important to highlight. The reason that's what the guidelines are stating is because we don't have the data. And I understand that's not what women want to hear. I understand that we need to do better, right? And we need to have more funding. I understand that. But I think there also can be risks, right? With, going ahead without the research. And that's just something that I always like to highlight to my patients, that they understand where we currently stand with that. When you look at the Women's Health Initiative study, again, the massive study that was published in 2002, there was actually double the risk of all-cause dementia in women aged older than 65 who received conjugated equinestrogen and the medroxyprogesterone acetate, so the synthetic estrogen and progestin. So again, if we initiate too late, right now, currently what we see is it could infer more risk. Now, a lot of people will say, well, what about body identical hormones or bioidentical hormones? And again, it's a great point, but we don't have the data. So I think until we have the data, I myself as a clinician would want to see that first before, I go down that route of saying or suggesting that this could be used for that reason. Yeah.
So right now, we don't have the evidence for menopause hormone therapy, but we do have evidence for lots of other things. Yeah. And one of the things I know you post about regularly that you're so passionate about is exercise. And I think we all know exercise is good for us, but I don't know if people realize the extent to which exercise is, I would say, the number one, if not one of the, it's probably the number one thing you can do for your brain health. With sleep. So, true. Sleep and then exercise. Yeah. It's true. They're both very, very important. Yeah. So, what do women need to think about with exercise specifically if they're trying to support brain health and cognitive function?
Yeah. One thing that I commonly see is, and again, might not be everyone, but what you mentioned about this being a busy time, right? We're busy, we're doing so much. And again, understandably, there is a lot going on. I do find that exercise tends to drop off, right? And again, it's not a judgment at all. It's just looking at your life and saying, okay, where could what I work with my patients is how can we get creative, right? You're dropping the kids off for practice. Where can we fit in maybe a walk around the rink? It's not, I'm not even at the stage where we're have to have this set routine, 7 times a day. I don't do that. It's about how can we fit it in. It's actually a lot more doable than a lot of people realize. But because we have this end goal of getting here, it's a barrier to even taking the first step. I just want to add, a lot of women have an all or nothing mentality. Exactly. So they think a 10-minute walk is useless. I'm going to only go if I can walk 45 minutes. And you don't realize that all those 10, I'm the weird hockey mom who's walking in circles at the arena, but it all adds up. It does. So we need to drop the all or nothing. Yeah. Take these little exercise snacks, just fit it in where you can. Yeah. And I'm forgetting his name. There's a cardiologist that posted about this, and he said it so perfectly. He said, think of exercise as a pill that takes 30 minutes to swallow. Yes, I love that. I was I couldn't have said it better myself, because there isn't anything that is going to replicate the benefits. And I think that's the point that I want to drive home. A supplement or even medication cannot replicate the brain, heart, all bone benefits that you're going to get get from exercise. And I know even from personal experience, when stress, gets to be a lot in life, it's holding on to those non-negotiables is what's going to keep you resilient, right? So if any way, again, it might look different than what it used to, but it's very different to still keep it in some capacity versus drop it off completely, right? So again, that could be walking, that could be, doing something at home instead of going to gym, because driving somewhere is a barrier, but that's okay, right? We're still getting it in as opposed to completely dropping it off. I know it's made such a huge difference in my life, but I will also tell you clinically, my patients in perimenopause who do the best are the ones who are consistently active.
100% agree.
Yeah.
And I just want to plug, because there's also this cardio fear happening.
Oh, right.
Cardio is so good for your brain. It does not raise cortisol. It doesn't cause weight gain. It is so helpful. So yes, you want to add in your strength training, which I 100% support, but not at the expense of cardio. We still need cardio. So do things that get your heart rate up. That's so good for your brain. One of the things that I like to counsel my patients on is around blood sugar. And one of the ways that I kind of question around this is around hangry. Because whenever I say blood sugar, people are like, I don't have a problem. I'm not diabetic. I'm like, how often do you get hangry? They're like, oh, every day. And I'm like, well, that's probably not a great sign about your blood sugar control. So what are some of the things that women maybe want to think about or start to include in their diet? Because again, this is also a time where there's often weight gain that people don't appreciate. People are often doing maybe a lower carb or like cutting things out. What are some of the nutrition things that we need to think about to support our memory and our brain?
Yeah, you make a really good point about the lower carb for sure. And I think what I often see is once I do like a full, sort of intake around the diet, a lot of people are actually doing it unintentionally. So it's not even like an intentional, I'm specifically removing these things, but they're doing it as part of what they've always, done as part of their diets. Carbs, we know, are incredibly important for our brains as well. And again, there's always going to be that word balance, but there is sort of a balance with the nutrition when it comes to that. And also I will say, I know people do talk a lot about protein. It's become one of the most talked about things, I think, in the nutrition space. Now, again, we don't need to be overdoing this protein. I think there's always going to be extremes to it. But I have to say, I do agree with the fact that a lot of women have under-fueled for a lot of their life, right? So the way that I see this is because perimenopause comes at a time with these erratic change in our hormones and fluctuations, these things that we do from like a diet lifestyle perspective almost become that non-negotiable because we're trying to get through this period of time that there are going to be fluctuating hormones, right? And again, that's going to happen in every single woman if she lives long enough. And it's about how do we help support that? So definitely carbs are not to be feared, but also protein, making sure you're getting enough at each meal. Those are two key things. And then of course, fiber is a key component of that. Sometimes I will see this too. There's been so much focus on protein that fiber has really dropped off, right? And we know that's actually so impactful for blood sugar management. So I don't like to really call anything a diet. Like I don't give a label to it. I'm more looking at, okay, are you getting 30 grams of fiber a day, right? Are we getting, 25 grams of protein per meal? And again, if that seems overwhelming, you don't know where to start, this is really where investing to work with someone can make a massive, massive difference because we take it step by step, right? You don't have to overhaul your diet overnight. It's about taking these incremental changes for sure.
Absolutely. What about brain games and puzzles? Like, do you know, is there any evidence that those are helpful for our brain?
Yeah, continuing cognitive activities is actually part of the 14 modifiable risk factors for dementia. So it is part of it. Again, I think it's important to keep our brains active for sure. It's a very low risk intervention, right? I think it's about setting that time, but there's many ways that we can keep active with our brains. It doesn't have to be puzzles or crosswords or things like that, but just in general, I think also that's where the social piece comes in, right? I do think if we keep that in, it's going to be much easier to keep up the cognitive activities as well. But there definitely is importance to that for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things I want to add, and I shared this on Instagram last week, but the other thing that I think women don't realize or that we often forget is the mental load that most of us are carrying. And so when we're forgetting a word or forgetting something if we didn't write it down, I think we also need to think about that in the context of the mental load that most of us are carrying. So some of the stats that I found around kind of how much data we're exposed to now is 74 gigabytes of data. Now, I didn't know what the heck that means, but it's equivalent of 16 movies or 174 newspapers a day. Wow. If you read 174 newspapers a day, how much do you think you would remember? Probably not a whole lot. So all of the volume of information that we are taking in is the equivalent of that. So it is no surprise that we are forgetful and that some things just don't stick. Like my favorite line that I say to my partner is like, that didn't make it into long-term storage. Like, I'm really sorry, but there's only so much room in here. And that just didn't make the cut. Like, sorry, you know? So I also think we need to be thinking about how much we're exposing ourselves to and how much just stuff our brain is having to analyze. And one of the things that I encourage my patients to think about, and this is something I heard from Tim Ferriss years ago, is this idea of a low information diet. Like, can you unsubscribe from emails? Can you actually listen to less podcasts? And yes, I'm saying this as someone who has a podcast. Like, you don't need to be learning something new every time you go for a walk. You don't need to be learning something new every time you're in your car. Right? Where can we give our brain these little like micro breaks where there isn't something being jammed into the brain?
It's so true. Yeah. Especially in a world where we have constant access to it, which we never used to. So I think that's a very important point, Sarah, for sure. And then you wonder on top of that with the hormone changes, with all that's going on at midlife, like, you know, it probably just compounds. It keeps compounding. And yeah, that's a really important point. It's how can we slow down in a way, but to actually speed up in terms of our symptoms. Yeah. 100%. Like to have that, clarity again.
So knowing that this is the fatigue fixer, what is like one thing that you would like women to think about or maybe to start doing that might help specifically around like memory and cognitive function?
I would say, again, you know, I'm so passionate about this, but one of the best things we can do for our brain health is exercise. So I would challenge all women to go for a 20-minute walk daily. Maybe start your day with it, end your day with it, whatever fits into your schedule, but fit it in. I always say we a lot of times don't feel motivated to do it, right? The motivation doesn't just come like, you know, for example, I work out in the morning. I can tell you at 6:30 a.m., I do not feel like working out. It's dark outside. It's winter time now, but I do it because I always think about how am I going to feel after it's done? And 10 out of 10 times, I feel amazing when it's done, right? So if you're always waiting for this motivation to come around, I'm going to tell you right now, it's probably not going to come. And so it's about how are you committing to this lifestyle? So again, that your 20, 30, 40-year-old self is going to thank you, but also you're going to benefit from it now because you're going to see the benefits.
Such good advice. I agree. And I also want to leave our listeners with some good news because I think, again, when we talk about perimenopause, a lot of it is very doom and gloom that like everything starts falling apart. And specifically when we're looking at memory, the hardest part for most women is that perimenopause and early menopause transition when your hormones are really starting to drop and to fluctuate. Once you are pretty entrenched in menopause, so about 6 years after your last menstrual period, we often see that memory comes back to baseline. So I know one of the scary things with memory is you think like it's never going to come back or it's just going to keep getting worse. And that for the vast majority of women is not the case. And the other thing that's happening with this brain remodeling is that women are more content after menopause. Their happiness levels are the highest that they are at any point. Our brains remodel to make us more empathetic. And a lot of women also just start giving fewer fucks about things that don't matter.
I don't know if it's allowed to swear on this podcast.
You can. We have an explicit thing, so go for it. Go for it.
But you bring up a really good point, Sarah, with the bounce back post-menopause of our cognitive changes, which I just want to highlight also tells us that a low estrogen state is not solely responsible for these changes, right? Because it does bounce back. So that's actually a very empowering thing to know.
I love that. Daiana, thank you so much for being here. I have learned so much, and I know our listeners have too. So if you've been feeling like your memory just isn't what it used to be, you're forgetting your words, you're misplacing things, or you're struggling to focus, I hope today's conversation has helped you see that you're not alone, and more importantly, that you're not losing your mind. These changes are a normal part of the menopause transition, and the good news is your memory will come back. Menopause-related brain fog isn't permanent. Your brain is recalibrating, adapting to shifting hormones, and it will find its balance again. So stock up on those Post-its, I have them everywhere, and trust that this phase won't last forever. And if you're worried about Alzheimer's, especially if it runs in your family, here's what you need to know. Alzheimer's is a disease of aging, but the foundation for brain health is built now in midlife. Your family history is not your destiny. In fact, as we talked about, up to half of Alzheimer's cases worldwide are linked to modifiable risk factors, things that are within your control, like managing your blood sugar, blood pressure, and weight, staying physically active, keeping your mind engaged, and spending time with your friends. So instead of fearing the future, focus on what you can do today to support your brain. Prioritize sleep, move your body, challenge your mind, manage your stress, and check out the Mind Diet, which I'll link to in the show notes. And most importantly, be kind to yourself. This transition is just that, a transition. Your brain is adjusting, and with the right support, you'll come through the other side feeling clearer, sharper, more confident, and more resilient than ever. Thank you for listening, and I will see you right back here in 2 weeks. Thanks for spending your precious time with me today. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you would send it to a woman in your life who needs to hear it. And there's no better way to help me reach more women who want to fix their fatigue than to take 2 minutes to leave a rating and review wherever you're listening to this. Ready to get more insight into what's making you tired? Find out which of the 5 most common types of fatigue you're dealing with by taking my fatigue fingerprint quiz at fatiguefixer.ca/quiz. Are you dealing with frazzled fatigue, where your body's exhausted but your brain won't shut up, making it hard for you to fall asleep? Or maybe you're more of the drained fatigue type, where no matter how much sleep you get, you're never rested and struggle to get up in the morning. Just take my fatigue fingerprint quiz and your results will include a list of recommended labs you can ask your doctor for, as well as my top recommendations for which habits and practices are best for fixing your type of fatigue. Find the quiz at fatiguefixer.ca/quiz. Because being tired all the time isn't normal, and you deserve to have good energy. Last but not least, I want to thank Jen Hudson and Mike Trutler over at Story Studio Network for bringing these conversations to life. I'll see you right back here in 2 weeks. Bye!